Esther chapter 4. Let's go ahead and read the whole chapter. Verse 1, it says, When Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes. And he went out into the midst of the city, and he cried with a loud and a bitter cry. And he came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. And so Esther's maid and her chamberlains came, and they told it her. And then was the queen exceedingly grieved, and she sent raiment to clothe Mordecai, and to take away his sackcloth from him, but he received it not. And then called Esther for Hatach, one of the king's chamberlains, whom he had appointed to attend upon her, and he gave him a commandment to Mordecai to know what it was and why it was. And so Hatach went forth to Mordecai into the street of the city, which was before the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened unto him, and of the sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasury for the Jews to destroy them. Also he gave them the copy of the writing of the decree that was given at Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and to declare it unto her, to charge her that she should go in unto the king, to make supplication unto him, and to make request before him for her people. And Hatach came, and he told Esther the words of Mordecai. And again Esther spake unto Hatach, and gave him commandment unto Mordecai. And all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king into the inner court, who is not called there is one, or who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come into the kingdom these 30 days. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words, and then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then there shall enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also, my maidens, will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. And so this is the fallout of chapter 3, where you have the writing of the decree that on such and such a date, several months out, all the Jews of Persia would be killed. People were literally commanded to rise up and come against the Jews who were in the kingdom. And so obviously this was a time of mourning, right? The Jewish people here knew and understood, we'll talk about this more later, but they knew and understood that this, for the king to have sealed this decree, which, remember, the king gave Mordecai his ring in order to seal the decree, for that decree to go out with the seal of the king, established that as fact. Nothing could change that. As we've talked about, and we'll see later on, the king can't even change that. The king can't send out a second decree, saying, never mind, ignore the first one. It can't be undone. And so they know that this is not only serious, but this is going to happen. Right? Nothing is going to stop this from taking place. And so there's a lot of mourning taking place. This is, you can imagine the kinds of things that would be happening all over the kingdom. And so Mordecai, even, he comes to the gate, and he's displaying himself as was common for the typical rites of mourning. He's in sackcloth, and he's crying out, and word gets to Esther about this. Now, for everything that we understand here, the text seems to suggest that she does not yet know, and so the women, the wives of Ahasuerus, probably aren't kept up to date with the current ongoings of the kingdom of Persia, and at least by her actions, she doesn't seem to know, and so she sends out a word to Mordecai to figure out. She sends him some clothes first of all, right? Get dressed, Mordecai. Stop acting this way. He refuses this. And so she sends out somebody to find out. It says to know what it was and why it was. Why are you acting this way? Obviously, this isn't normal. Something has taken place that would cause you to act out in such a way. And so Mordecai sends word back to her, and he tells her everything. He tells her about, I would assume, tells her about the plot that he overheard, how he saved the king, and then all of this led into Haman's desire for for people to bow down, and how he refused to do this. The decree went out and everything. He tells her, and he even sends her a copy of the decree. Don't just take my word for it. Here it is. Read it for yourself. And then he gives her this charge, and this is significant for a lot of reasons. But this is significant because this is a turning point for Mordecai. And says she should go in unto the king to make supplication unto him and to make request before him for her people. Now remember, up to this point, Mordecai was the one telling her, don't let anybody know. Right? Don't let anybody know who you are. Don't let them know that you're a Jew. Hide that fact from everybody. And that now here, he tells her, you need to go make a request for your people. Right? And incumbent on that would be that she would have to reveal who her people are. Right? And so he's telling her now is the time for you to, stop blending in. Now is the time for you to stand out. Now is the time for you to go to the king and let him know what's going on. Now, I don't think there's any question that Mordecai loved Esther. I don't think there's any question that Mordecai would have done anything for her. And so the fact that he was asking her to do this, again, lets us know that he and all the Jews of the kingdom know this is not a veiled threat. This was not something that he was putting out there to, maybe scare them, and now they'll pay more taxes or they'll pay more tribute, right? This wasn't a scare tactic. The second that decree went out, that was the final word on the matter. And so he knows that. Again, they all know this. And so if nothing changes, then the decree will be carried out and the Jews in Persia will be destroyed. And he knows he has to send Esther because she's not going to be excluded from this. The second that somebody finds out, and eventually they would find out, but the second that somebody finds out that she was a Jew, it doesn't matter that she's the queen. She would fall under that particular decree because the decree didn't give any exclusions. And so the fact that she was a Jew, that was all it would take. And so he sends word that, you have to go do this. Now Esther is, she's nervous about this. Understandably so. She responds and she just tells him, I can't. Nobody's allowed to go to the king. Right? He has to call you. Nobody's allowed to go. And I haven't even seen him in 30 days. Right? Which goes to tell you how kind of excluded the women were. She was, I think we could safely assume, one of the more favored wives of Ahasuerus. And yet she hasn't even seen him in 30 days. And so, basically she's saying there's no chance he's going to just randomly call upon me sometime soon that I can go talk to him about this. Now, just from a historical standpoint, we have validity to what she's saying. And always, we don't need this, but it kind of helps to give some background on this. Herodotus was a Greek historian and wrote about this particular era. He confirms that the Persians did in fact have a law in place, that they had this law in place, that you don't come before the king when he's on his throne. It's not saying that the king is never approachable, but when the king is sitting on the throne doing what the king does, you don't approach him unless the king specifically calls you to him, or hands out the golden scepter, as the text says. And then Josephus, in conjunction with Herodotus, he writes that the throne, he confirms Herodotus's words that this was a law. And then he says that the throne was consistently surrounded by men with axes in hand, so that if somebody should approach, they could quickly deal with the problem. And so when we understand all of this, we see very easily and understandably, and we sympathize with Esther in this, why she's not just so gung-ho to say, oh, sure, let me just make a quick trip down and, talk to Ahasuerus. And so she's hesitant. At first, she's hesitant. Now, I do like what Matthew Henry says about the whole situation here. He says, it was bad for their subjects. For what good had they of a king that they might not ever have liberty to apply to for the redress of grievances? It is not thus in the court of the King of Kings. To the footstool of his throne of grace we may at any time come boldly and may be sure of an answer of peace to the prayer of faith. And so it's just another in a long line of ways in which the King of Kings is the greatest king, right? And all the kings of the earth fall in honor, fall in authority. They fell in every conceivable way when compared to the greatest king. And here, we might not even think about this, but we don't have to have this worry when it comes to Jesus. Hebrews 4 tells us this, that we can come boldly under the throne of grace. And so we don't have to worry, well, maybe he's busy. Maybe he can't, really take my time right now. No, we always have access to the throne of our King. And so just, again, one way in which he's greater. Now Mordecai is not sympathetic. Mordecai here sends back word, true and pointed words. Essentially, this, Esther, there's no waffling here. This is a time for action. You don't get to have the choice, given the situation that you have found yourself in. And you know what? I respect him for this. That he is not just thinking about himself. This isn't just an issue where if you don't act, I'm going to be harmed. Right? Esther, you are in a unique position to not just save you, not just save me, but to save all the Jews in the entire kingdom. And so again, he doesn't just relent and say, well, I don't want to hurt your feelings on this. No, he speaks the truth to her. Esther must act or they will all die. Now this includes, I mentioned this earlier, this includes Esther, right? And he tells her later, he says, if you don't act, you and your father's house will be destroyed. And so this includes Esther. She too would succumb to the same fate if she doesn't do something. And then Mordecai makes what is a very, very interesting phrase. And it is here in this particular chapter why Mordecai does stand out as someone to be emulated in some degree. We've talked about already the ways in which Esther and Mordecai maybe aren't such a great example, but chapter 4, they stand out as examples. And so here Mordecai shows a surprising degree of faith in God. He says that, he tells her, God is going to bring, he says, enlargement and deliverance. So here's what he tells her. This decree, even though we know it was sealed by the king, even though we know that means it's going to be carried out, there's nothing stopping it. And so he tells her essentially, we know that what the king decreed is going to happen, but I also know my God. And I know my God is going to keep a remnant. That's essentially the argument that he's making. There is going to be deliverance, and not just deliverance, enlargement, right? This is not going to hinder God. Just because this particular decree came out does not mean that God is throwing up his hands in heaven and thinking, well, I don't know what I'm going to do now. No, he is not hindered by this. Not only will there be deliverance of at least a remnant, but there will be an enlargement. There will be a grace that comes as a result of this particular incident. And so one way or another, God is going to give enlargement. He's going to give deliverance. But God has chosen Esther to be the means of that particular deliverance. And so what he appeals to then is not only his faith. Obviously he believes that God's going to do this, but he appeals to God's providence, something we've talked about quite often. Now we have to remember this. Even when things don't make a whole lot of sense to us, and I would submit that maybe that's more often than we care to admit. Even when things don't make a whole lot of sense to us, even if we are, we have our back to the wall and we're just sitting there, and sometimes we have a little pity party, and when we like to think, well, God's just forgotten me. God's forgotten his promises. God has rejected me. God has forsaken me. We have to understand, we have to know, we have to believe that God has never forgotten. He has never broken. He never will break or forget his promises. He is faithful to the very end. Isaiah 49 says, but Zion said, the Lord hath forsaken me, and my Lord hath forgotten me. And then he says this, here's his answer. Can a woman forget her suckling child, that she should not have compassion on the son of her womb? He says, yea, they may forget, yet I will not forget thee. He says, literally, a mother is more likely to forget her nursing child than God is able to forget you, the people to whom he has made promises to. Now, keep in mind, this does not negate the fact that the decree has gone out. This does not negate the predicament that the Jewish people in Persia have found themselves in. They were in a very bad situation. They were in a very difficult, dangerous situation. But God was still faithful. God had not forgotten them. And so sometimes we think, well, look at the situation I'm in, right? This is bad. This is dangerous maybe even. But that doesn't necessarily mean, well, let me just say it never means, but that doesn't necessitate the fact that God has forgotten you, right? God has a will. God is sovereign. God gives providence. And perhaps he's led you into this situation so that you can greater see his power and authority to lead you through this particular situation. Paul writes about a similar thing, 2 Corinthians chapter 1, right? And I talk about this a lot, but I think it's such a powerful story where Paul makes mention of a particular time, and he doesn't give the details, but he says that there were in an instance where they thought they were going to die, right? And he says it just point blank. We thought this was it. And that's something coming from Paul, who has experienced a lot of things. But Paul said, this is the one that I really thought that was it. I thought my life was over. But God spared us. Why? And then he says this, so that we would learn to trust in him. So that we would learn to have more faith in the God who was able to bring us through even this, whatever it was, terrible situation. And so Mordecai has that faith because he believes in God and he believes in God's providence. And so this is where he gives what is evidently the most famous line of the book, right? This is the line that everybody thinks about when they think of the book of Esther. He says, God has led you here where? For such a time as this. And this is such a powerful statement, especially when you really think about Esther. Esther was a Jewish girl living in captivity, right? She's not a Persian. She wasn't native born to that country. She was a Jewish-born girl who was in the captivity of a nation who had conquered her own, living away from her nation, away from her people, and yet somehow has become the queen of Persia. Things like that don't just happen. And so here Mordecai is appealing to God's providence. God obviously had a reason for doing what he has done in your life. And so this is, he has led you here. And I think it's very obvious to see, Esther, that it was for this moment, for this time, and for this purpose. And so God does the same with you and I today. And it's something we need to really think about. His providence will place us in the places and situations that we need to be in order to make a difference for the cause of Christ. And I love Spurgeon's quote on this. He says, you have been wishing for another position where you could do something for Jesus. And then he says this, do not wish anything of the kind, but serve him where you are. Serve him where you are. Right? A lot of people have the mindset, well, if I was the queen, then maybe I can make a difference. If I was the king, maybe I could make a difference. Well, if God wanted you to be the king, guess what? You'd be the king. He didn't make you the king. He made you what you are. He has you where you are. Serve him where you are. Proverbs 3. This is something that we have tried to kind of implement kind of as a family model for us. It says, withhold not good from them to whom it is due. And then it adds this, when it is in the power of thine hand to do it. Well, when do we have the ability to do that? Well, let me rephrase. Where do we have the ability to do that? We have the ability to do that wherever God has you. Wherever God has you. Right? God, I've said this so many times in the past. God has specific ministries for all of us, right? For every Christian. As I've said so many times in the past, you will have the ability and the capacity to reach people I might not ever even meet. I have the ability and the capacity to reach people you might not ever meet, right? And so God has us where he has us for a reason. And so for such a time as this, could apply to a lot of people in a lot of situations. And those words seem to strengthen Esther. She realized that what he was saying was true. There's no getting around it. And so there's a you can see how she's been fortified. She's determined now. And so at the end of verse 15, she says, go gather together, verse 16, go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast from me, neither eat nor drink 3 days, night nor day. And then she says at the end of the verse, I'll go to the king. And then she says, and if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish. Now here is where Esther shines, right? This is where she really does become that example. Not for a second do we want to diminish the bravery of Esther. It would take immense courage to go before the king of Persia on a throne surrounded by men with axes, knowing that you have not been summoned, and to not only go into that position knowing that you haven't been called to do so, but then to make this grand reveal. Oh, by the way, I know I've been married to you for several years now, but I'm a Jew, and you've put out this decree that all the Jews should be killed, right? The courage that it would take for her to do this is impressive beyond any measure. And then to add on top of that, she goes in with the mindset, if I perish, I perish. Now she asks everybody to fast for her. Now, the assumption would be here that they're not just fasting. The assumption would be here that prayer is going along with the fasting. Not only is that just in keeping with Jewish tradition, but if I had a big event that was spiritual in nature, right, and I wanted people to support me in that, if I just said, well, you fast for 3 days, but you didn't pray, your fasting hasn't accomplished anything, right? I mean, maybe your health, but your fasting hasn't accomplished anything. The assumption is when she says this, that they're also praying on the behalf of Esther. And this, we talked about this in the introduction, but this is one of the reasons why, some people get bent out of shape with the book of Esther, because, prayer is not even mentioned, but it is assumed. It is assumed in situations like this. And so they're fasting, again, assuming that they're also praying. I like what Brenneman says. He says, Esther believed God answers prayer. And then he says this, such prayer changes situations. In fact, it is one of the chief instruments God uses to change history. And prayer, I won't take much time here, but prayer is such a fascinating thing because the God of the universe, who is sovereign and omniscient, already knows the end from the beginning, still yet chooses to operate in this world through the means of the prayers of his people. And so there is a sense in which we are responsible for the things that happen in this world because God chooses to operate through the means of the prayers of his people. Now, did he have to do it that way? No, obviously he didn't, but that's the way he's chosen to do it. And so it is not only responsibility on ours, but it is also a tremendous privilege to be one of his children and to go back to what we said earlier, to have that free access to the throne where we can go and pray. And we can have the ear of God. And so this is a tremendous gift that he has given to his people. And so I agree wholeheartedly with the words of Brenneman here. Now, again, she carries herself, as I said, with boldness, right? If I perish, I perish. And I love, Chuck Swindoll, he has a way with words. She has changed from fear to abandonment and faith, from hesitation to confidence and determination, from concern for her own safety to concern for her people's survival. She has reached her own personal hour of decision and has not been found wanting. And as I've said all along, this is where Esther truly does shine. So it is here in this hour of bravery that she becomes that example. That one that we said previously she was not, now she is. And I'll close with the words of Paul, Philippians 1:21, for me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. And that ought to be the mindset of every Christian. Come what may, because the worst the world can do to me, the absolute worst the world can do to me, is simply to hasten my presence with my Savior. That's the worst the world can do. And so for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. So we should all carry that mindset. You know what? I'm just going to do what God wants. And if I perish, I perish. Now, that doesn't mean be reckless. We're not saying throw yourselves into situations you ought not to be in. We're not saying, live in such a way that you are really actively trying to hasten the day of your demise. But we live in such a way that, if for the cause of Christ it comes upon me, then so be it. And I will be the better off for it. So again, Esther here, this is where she becomes a great, great example for all of us to follow. All right. Well, I actually don't